Sorry.
That's right. Well, welcome to Limayim, Water, Climate Change, and You. And we get started. I'd love to start with a flashback to middle school science class, where ideally you should have learned about the water cycle. And I love the water cycle. So water falls as precipitation, as rain or snow. The mountains in Colorado full of snow are sometimes called water towers because that's where our water is really held. The snow melts in the springtime and comes off as surface runoff. It gets into our rivers and then into our reservoirs, sometimes our lakes. The sun up here, there's atmospheric demand. The atmosphere is drier than the water, so it's sucking the water directly out of our streams and our lakes and our reservoirs. That's evaporation. Any plant that wants to grow has to breathe out water. That's transpiration. All that water gets back into the atmosphere. It condenses. It falls again as precipitation, and it's really a cycle. And we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about how climate change is messing up our water cycle in a lot of different ways. But that's just a little background to keep in mind. So the whole first part of the presentation is just, I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff about water because you really need some background to engage in talking about water. And then we'll talk about climate change, and then we'll talk about things that you can do. Okay, so the first thing is that we measure water in a couple of different ways. So you probably heard about an acre foot. That's when we think about water as volume, like how much water is in your bathtub. Acre foot is pretty self-explanatory. You take an acre of land, you put a foot of water on it, and that's how you measure an acre foot. And that's about 326,000 gallons. Typical family in Colorado will use about half of an acre foot a year. If a farmer wants to grow an acre of corn, they would need about 1.6 acre feet, so to irrigate each acre of corn. So you can see, kind of plants need water to grow. So to have agriculture, that consumes a lot of water, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But we also think about water as flow. So flow is how much water is, kind of whooshing past you at any one moment. And if you graph the flows in a river, and interestingly, this is kind of a convention, the river water year starts October 1st. So this is kind of a typical river in Colorado. Flows are pretty low through most of the year. The snow melts, we get a big peak of water. Flows are really high, and then they come down, and the cycle starts again. And so this is measured in what we call cubic feet per second. So you take a cubic foot, you imagine, each of those, whooshing by you each second. And that's how we measure the flow in our rivers, where like the Mississippi River on average might be flowing at 590,000 cubic feet every second. Boulder Creek might be at 79. So, there's kind of big fluctuations. And again, climate change, this is called a hydrograph. And you'll sometimes hear people say that climate change is messing with our hydrograph, which it is. We can also talk about that. Okay. So Colorado is a headwater state. So what that means is that we need to share our water with our neighbors. By law, Colorado can really only use about 40% of the water that originates in Colorado. And so there are all of these legal compact agreements, they're called, where we have to share water. So we share water to Nebraska through the South Platte. We share water to Kansas. The biggest one is out of the Colorado River. And you probably have seen news stories about the Colorado River Basin compacts and the amount of water that Colorado and the other headwater states need to deliver to the lower basin states. So another thing to note, and I like this diagram is a little bit out of date, but I like it because the flows are kind of shown as these different sized arrows. About 80% of water in Colorado is on the western slope, and about 80% of the people are on the eastern slope of Colorado. So Colorado, there's a lot of plumbing in Colorado. There are these trans-mountain diversions that are taking water from the western slope and bringing it over to the Front Range, where most of the people are. So if you, if you are in Denver, if you're served by Denver water and you want to hold up your glass of Denver water, where's your water coming from? And do you know that? So, some of Denver water's water is stored in places like Chatfield Reservoir. Well, where is that water really coming from? That water is coming from Dillon Reservoir. It's coming from the Blue River on the western slope. It goes, through the mountains in the Harold Roberts Tunnel, for example, and gets over to the east. So when you're, if you're living in Boulder and Denver in the Front Range and you're hearing about Colorado River issues and concerns, you might think, oh, well, that doesn't affect me. That's, the other side of the state. But everyone on the Front Range is using some fraction of Colorado River water. So that is diverted over to our side of the state. It never goes back. Okay. You've probably heard about water rights. Water rights are enshrined in the Colorado Constitution. It was really one of the reasons that the Colorado Constitution was developed, was to regulate systems of water rights. So when you hold a water right, you actually hold the right to use the water. You don't actually own the water itself. So the water is in fact owned by the citizens of Colorado, but your right to use the water is a private property right that you can buy and sell and trade. And I found this amazing picture from 1874. It's in the Colorado Encyclopedia of, early farmers, irrigators, building a diversion to get water to their fields. The way that water rights work in Colorado, and this is really different, it's entirely different from the East Coast of the US, and actually different from California as well, but Colorado and a lot of other Western states follow something called the doctrine of prior appropriation, which means that the first person to have started using the water, their water right is tied to the date when they first started using that water, and they have priority for that water use. So for example, if you're a senior user of water and you have a 1910 water right, and someone upstream of you only started using water in 1970 and the stream flow is low, they get shut off to the upstream, but more junior user gets shut off to give the water to the more senior user. And Colorado has an entire legal system, our state water law courts, that are just around adjudicating, issues and conflicts and so on around water rights, because this is such a fundamental part of the way that water works in Colorado. Tribal nations often hold the most senior water rights. So when reservations were established, they were established with the water that the tribe would need to, do agriculture, sustain its people. The Supreme Court, codified this. But tribes often don't actually have access to the water that they're entitled to. So there's no physical infrastructure to get to their water. So it's a real equity issue across the West. Okay, another thing, we're still in the random things you need to know about water part of the talk. So it's important to know the difference between what is a consumptive use of water and what is a non-consumptive use. So here we have our diversion again. So water is being, diverted from a river. It gets into our drinking water treatment plant. It, comes out your sink, your pipe. You can fill your water glass with water. So, in your house, for example, you might take a shower. And the water comes, out the tap, goes into the drain through the wastewater treatment plant and gets back into the river. So, when you flush a toilet, when you use a washing machine, when you take a shower, those are all non-consumptive uses. The water gets back into the system. But if you have a lawn or a tree or a garden, which is consuming the water, so that water, again, if you remember in our water cycle, the transpiration, that's a consumptive use, or a farmer, using water on their fields. So there's a big difference between consumptive and non-consumptive uses. And when we're thinking about drought, so that's why like water utilities will often be really concerned with consumptive uses, where non-consumptive uses, some of that water can be recycled, and gets back into the river. But anything that you do to the water, the soaps that you use, any chemicals that you're using, a lot of that doesn't get treated in wastewater treatment plants, and so the water that is returned in this return flow is generally of poorer quality, than the original water that came out of the river. Oh, there we go. Yep. So watering your lawn consumes water. Taking a shower is going to generate return flows. So who uses water in Colorado? It's mostly agriculture, because plants need water to grow. So you can't have crops, you can't have agriculture without water. So it's greater than about 80% of water in Colorado, and that's pretty consistent actually worldwide, is for agricultural water use, with a decent chunk for municipal and industrial. And out of that, it's really lawns and landscaping that use up, most of that municipal use. And again, as I mentioned before, we only consume, we can only use about 40% of the water that originates in Colorado, because as a headwater state, we need to give our water to others. But some of the most important non-consumptive uses of water are, of course, environmental. So we need water to sustain native fish. This is, I believe, a native pike minnow, so an endangered fish in Colorado. We need it for riparian areas, endangered species, wildlife, birds, fish. If you go for a hike, where do people like to go hiking? Near water. Like, water sustains us so much, culturally, spiritually, all of the environmental needs, and those are all kind of considered non-consumptive. The fish isn't using up the water, but that's why it's critically important that we keep healthy flows in our rivers. Okay, and then another non-consumptive use is recreation. So the water-based recreation in Colorado is something like I think a $6 billion industry. So there's a tremendous amount of water recreation that happens: fishing and paddling and rafting. People traveling to the state for all of these activities, and these are also non-consumptive uses of water. All right, so that was the water section. That was kind of your primer on lots of things about water to think about. And now we're going to move into the climate change section. So I'll do a little Limayim toast for in between our sections. So what's happening to our water cycle as a result of climate change? And one way we can think about this is that climate change is speeding up the cycle. The sun is hotter. So, the amount of transpiration and evaporation happens, much more intensely. And, that if you have a garden and it's hot and it's dry and it's windy, you have to water your garden more. The plants need to transpire water more, to be able to survive. A warmer atmosphere holds more water. And so that's the reason for some of these giant atmospheric rivers, like my parents have just experienced in Los Angeles, with these really intense rainstorms that we have, because the warmer atmosphere is holding more water, so that we're getting water, bigger floods, more amount of precipitation at the same time. Snowmelt is happening faster. So, snowmelt is happening earlier in the spring, rather than being kind of stretched out over a longer period of time. So that's another piece of the acceleration of the cycle. And we're also not getting, because the land is thirsty, some of that water isn't actually, that melts off from our snowmelt doesn't actually make it to our rivers. So there's a lot of water, that gets captured back into the soil. And that general, kind of speeding up of water, which we accelerate when we, when we have, a lot of pavement, when, when we have deforestation, when we don't have, kind of healthy riparian and wetlands, the water is running off too fast. So it's both climate change and land use together are really accelerating these cycles in ways that are both, bad for ecosystems and, create risk for people in terms of, more drought, more flood. And that's one of the things that, at the Nature Conservancy and at other, organizations, governments that, we're trying to do things to kind of slow down the cycle. So, how can we retain water in the landscape, to kind of stop these, really fast runoff cycles from happening, including, interestingly, one animal that really helps with kind of retaining water in the landscape are beavers. And so the loss of beavers, across the West has really also been part of this kind of water acceleration. Okay, so in general, with climate change, hotter equals drier, but also more flood risk. And so just to really see this, so these are annual average temperatures in the Colorado River Basin. It's 1895 to 2019. And the average is the pre-2000 average. So that's our kind of average line. And so since 2000, every single year has been hotter than the 1970 to 1999 average. So it's not even the average all the way back to 1900. And so we've had 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit of warming just from 1980 to 2019 in the Colorado River Basin. So that, climate change and warming is already here. And the Colorado River Basin is actually a hot spot for climate warming. And, so that's the world that we're living in. The 2000 to 2022 was the driest 23-year period on record. Actually, they think going back like thousands of years. 2023 was very wet. So that did, kind of alter that a little bit. But overall, the flow in the Colorado River has declined by 20% since 2000. And that's, I think, based on a decline from a 1980 to 2000 baseline. And, we saw a lot of these kind of crisis pictures, the bathtub ring in Lake Powell, we have these giant reservoirs. And so the concern is that if the levels in Lake Powell drop enough, first of all, it could stop the hydropower. So we get a lot of fossil fuel-free electricity from the reservoirs. And if the flow dropped low enough, it could actually be below the level where the dam can release water at all, which would stop flows through the Grand Canyon, which would be, kind of really catastrophic. So all of the upper Colorado Basin and lower Colorado Basin states are kind of in this big negotiation around, how do we cut uses so to, sustain the river. The Colorado River provides water to 40 million people. So it's pretty significant. So what are some of our other kind of critical water issues in Colorado? So we have a supply and demand issue. The population is forecasted to increase to about 8 million by 2050. And that is, the state is projecting a pretty large water gap. Like, we don't have the water to sustain this number of people, particularly, if we don't make big changes in the way that we use water. So if all of these people were living in a kind of typical suburban home with a typical suburban lawn, we don't have the water to accommodate that. And again, you can see that most of that growth is happening again, in the Front Range, where most of the water is on the western slope. Another kind of critical water issue, which really affects environmental justice issues, which we'll be hearing more about next month, is around water quality. So rivers in Colorado are still contaminated with heavy metals, particularly lead and copper from mining, both current mining operations, historic mining operations. If people remember, in 2015, there was a blowout at a Gold King mine cleanup site, resulting in a major wastewater spill into the Animas River. There were pictures at the time of people kayaking in the river. So just as an aside, like if your river, turns bright orange with mine waste, like don't go kayaking. Bad idea. But anyway, so that's, kind of an ongoing issue in Colorado. We have significant contamination of, from oil and gas development, particularly into groundwater, but also into surface water. So petroleum, other chemicals, PFAS, and other kind of emerging contaminants, particularly issues in, our water here, kind of all over the country. High nutrients from fertilizer runoff, that's primarily agricultural, but what you put on your lawn also makes a difference. Higher temperatures are affecting our cold water fish. And so that their habitat area is shrinking as a result of climate change. And floods after wildfires can be really problematic in terms of excess sediment in rivers and reservoirs, which again is, something that beavers can actually help with. In terms of, beaver dams can trap a lot of sediment, particularly in high elevation areas. So another, kind of key thing that we need is we need functioning rivers with, the associated riparian corridors and wetlands. And so this is just a picture on the Dolores River of a deliberate high flow release that was done in 2017. Because what happens when dams are put into rivers is, if you remember our hydrograph, starting low and going high, is that reservoirs get filled up off the top of the hydrograph oftentimes. And so we start to miss those peaks. And you really need, that's what you need to, regenerate cottonwoods and willows, and to have, these healthy floodplains that the water is moving across. And so, in this case, the Nature Conservancy and some other organizations work together to, develop a protocol so that there could be this kind of big release of spring water to, kind of help regenerate some of the riparian habitat that is needed. Oops. Okay. And then, the lack of access to safe, affordable, and adequate water supplies, again, is a really significant environmental justice issue. So, we know that environmental racism over time has impacted access to clean water. That, tribal nations, that was really highlighted during COVID-19, the lack of domestic water, of, clean and running water for sanitation, for health. And, we know that cities have lead pipes and that there's, elevated lead concentrations in drinking water, and, the impacts that that has, particularly, on babies and children. So, okay, so the what can you do piece of it. So it matters to, be reducing our water use, and particularly to be reducing our consumptive water use. And so the state has made a new term. If you've heard of xeriscaping, they're now calling it Coloradoscape. And that's really about reducing non-functional turf, and promoting native plants, which have the side benefit of, benefiting pollinators. So this is just an example of Resource Central out in Boulder, has a garden in a box program. You sign up with them, and they actually have the 2024 signups are going on now. They give you plants and a little, map, put this one here and that one there. That's what it might look like in year 1. And that's what it would look like in year 3. And, and that's particularly, for people where non-functional turf is really like decorative grass, not the grass that you're running around and playing on with, kids and dogs and so on. Low flow water fixtures, because, even though those are non-consumptive uses, particularly, that water again is coming out of rivers, becoming degraded, as it goes through your house. And really thinking about, water quality. So, what is going down your drain or running off from your yard makes a difference in terms of collective action. If you have a house with a downspout, you can have rain barrels. And it actually was a law that had to be passed in Colorado to allow rain barrels because of prior appropriation. So the theory is that, that rain that was falling on your house actually belonged to someone else in their water right. And the legislature decided that that was pretty de minimis. And you are allowed to have 2 rain barrels, up to 55 gallons each, that you can use for outdoor irrigation. We put in 2 barrels from this Blue Barrel Systems company. I'm glad to talk to people about that. It was super easy to do. And particularly like if we go into a drought year and there's watering restrictions, it's really nice to have 110 gallons of water, sitting at your house that you can use. And then locally, so this is just a nice picture of like really non-functional turf. No one is ever going to walk on that, picnic on that, do anything except mow it. And, you can become an advocate if you're part of an HOA, a community center, a business park, municipality, to really push to remove this non-functional turf. And there's probably payment incentives are available now. There was some legislation passed, and, most of the water providers, that there's state programs to pay to remove non-functional turf. And if you want to learn more about that, the Colorado Water Conservation Board, recently put out, they had an urban landscape conservation task force. They just recently put out their final report. It has a lot of great information on turf removal, on water-wise landscapes, avoiding unintended consequences. So you can find that online, the Urban Landscape Conservation Task Force. And, we can advocate statewide. So if you want to really understand water at the state level, Colorado has a water plan developed by the Colorado Water Conservation Board. It was originally 2015 and was revised in 2023. Again, look for it online, Colorado Water Plan. It's a pretty easy read, it's pretty non-technical, and will really give you a picture of, kind of water issues in Colorado, and, what is needed. And as part of the development of the water plan, the state set up 9 basin roundtables, they're called. So each major river basin has a roundtable. So it's essentially an entity that was set up to develop these locally driven and collaborative solutions. And people are appointed to their basin roundtables to represent different groups, agriculture, recreation, environment, local citizens, and you can go. So, these meetings are open to the public. If you really want to learn like what's happening in the Denver metro area, with the South Platte, with water, go to your basin roundtable meetings. So that's, really a local advocacy opportunity for folks. And we can track, the legislation that's happening. So back to our non-functional turf. So this year, Senate Bill 24005 was just passed on a bipartisan basis out of the Senate to actually prohibit the use of non-native turf on seldom used areas. So, this is about, so you can't put in new non-functional turf. And if you support this, you can contact your representative, or you can talk about this on lobby day to express your support for Senate Bill 005. So it was one of the very first bills introduced and was, again, passed out of the Senate on a bipartisan basis. So that's one of the ways, we can protect the wasteful use of water. And at a federal policy level, really what's key right now is protecting these really big federal investments. So the Inflation Reduction Act, we're often familiar with as, kind of the biggest source of funding for climate, for combating climate change. It also has an enormous amount of money for water. I think it was $4 billion for drought, alleviating drought in the West. So for investing in different kinds of water projects. And the bipartisan infrastructure law has more than $15 billion to remove lead pipes across the country. So, a really significant investment by EPA in water quality and healthy water. And these, investments are vulnerable. As Congress is wheeling and dealing, these bills were passed, but the money can also be taken away. So, if you're reaching out and, kind of engaging with your federal, it matters that our federal delegation hears from us that we care about these bills and we care about water in these bills. All right, so I threw some resources in. I don't know, Moshe, if you share the slide deck later, or people can take a little picture of it. So just, different places you can go to learn more. And we can go to questions. I didn't really share about like what I do day to day, for water, but just trying to give you the big picture on, water, climate impacts on water, and some of the ways that can engage. All right. Left little sign. Great, Lori.
I was trying to find my electronic hand and I couldn't. What is the impact of fracking on groundwater, on anything, everything?
Yeah, significant. So, for a couple, from a couple of different perspectives. So that's not something that I work on like professionally. So this is me with my like not professional hat on. But first of all, fracking takes an enormous amount of water. And then that water is degraded through the fracking process. And then generally my understanding is kind of re-injected under the ground. So, fracking is really problematic from both an air quality and a water quality point of view. And there's that, again, just kind of me talking as me. So, maybe I should actually turn off my background and then I'll, again, it's not something that I, work on professionally, but, that's kind of my understanding is, so, and I think hopefully everyone has seen the initiative to try to get an anti-fracking initiative on the ballot. And, so we can really be thinking about that from a, climate point of view, an air quality point of view, and a water point of view.
Thank you.
Deborah.
Had to find my unmute. So I used to work for EPA, just as full disclosure. And then I now have a group called Wild Ones Front Range, and we help people take out lawns and put in native plants. But what I'm worried about, and I do hear from people, well, the water issue for lawns isn't that important because 87% of our water goes to agriculture. So it's a drop in the bucket. So I'd love your perspective on how I can answer that. I think I heard something in your presentation, but also I'm all worried. What I see in my neighborhood is people putting plastic grass down, thinking, and they love to show it to me because they know I'm into, taking out lawns. I keep saying, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. So just an aside, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not an aside. It's actually kind of critical. So Senate Bill 005 that we were just talking about that bans non-functional turf actually also bans artificial grass.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So they, so in like a new commercial development, you can't put in your bluegrass, but you also can't put in your fake grass. So it needs to be native landscaping. I think it can also be, some mulch and rocks and whatever. But the booklet that I was showing you, the Urban Landscape Task Force, so that could be a good thing for you to share with your neighbors, like really goes into a lot of the issues, because one of the problems with artificial turf is both increasing the heat island effect in cities. So it's problematic for that. Some types of artificial turf, there's been some heavy metal issues with it, but I don't know that all of the brands have that problem. I think some of them did. And it doesn't, help our pollinators, or wildlife.
No, it's a dead zone.
Yeah, but so here's the answer to why it matters, and it matters, I think, from a few perspectives. So while of the total water used in Colorado, municipal is relatively small, of the municipal chunk, landscaping is an enormous percentage of that chunk. And as you saw, there's significant amount of water that goes from the West Slope to the Front Range. So if you're someone who cares about the health, you like to go up into the mountains and you like to see the beautiful rivers, with the fish and everything, what you're doing collectively, the collective you, like what you're doing on your lawn in Denver, makes a difference to how much water is diverted from the Western Slope. So there really is an environmental impact, where a lot of the water use, like on the Western Slope for ag, is Western Slope water, some of which is, then also, kind of irrigating some of the riparian areas, because it's a lot of, kind of hay meadows, some of which are, native species, some of which are not. But there's kind of and then there's kind of the other point is that, like, if, if someone is going to point at agriculture and say, you're being wasteful for water and you have a giant suburban lawn, agriculture would say, well, we're growing food, like, what are you doing
What are you
with
growing?
your water? Right. So,
okay.
Just as a sort of almost like an equity thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So maybe some of those ideas would.
Yes. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It sounds like you have a great organization. So maybe you can throw that in the chat.
Yeah, I can.
Good. Moshe.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was great. And my question is, what happens to the water that's used for consumptive uses? Sort of, what's the time frame in which it sort of gets back into this possible, to be usable again? And are there any sort of serious efforts to significantly change how agriculture works, like through, I guess, drip irrigation or other, instead of sort of like flood irrigation? And is there anything that we can expect to, that might dramatically change how we farm?
Yeah. So were you asking really about non-consumptive, how it gets back into the system, or consumptive?
No, consumptive, like, right, if like water that's used for agriculture,
right,
and sort of, as opposed to water that can sort of go back into back into the rivers very quickly. What's the time frame for consumptive use? If then it's what happens to it? Like,
right. So water that gets evaporated into the atmosphere, will eventually at some point, condensation will happen, and, that water will become rain or snow. It's actually a really interesting question which I don't really know the answer to. We certainly have, like small convective cycles. So this is actually sort of an interesting thing in Colorado. Like, the best predictor of whether it will rain today is whether it rained yesterday, because, particularly in the summer, like, there's enough evaporation, like from a rainstorm, that, like those afternoon thunderstorms, a lot of that might be like yesterday's evaporation, becoming tomorrow's rainstorm. But, some of that obviously is going to like go up into the clouds, and there's going to be, big cloud movements and wind and atmospheric rivers and so on. And yeah, like how much, I don't know, like I feel like there must, I know there's, big centers in Colorado that, kind of study all of the, physics of water movement. And I don't really know like how much, sort of evaporates and then falls again as rain, like more locally, and how much becomes, part of, kind of regional or even like global rainfall patterns. But it's actually a really interesting point that we know that, when you cut down forests, you decrease rainfall in those areas because you've lost that. And I think they're really seeing that in the Amazon. So there is actually like a pretty direct link between the amount of water being transpired by the forest and what the rain that's falling on the forest. So I don't have like a number or percentage, but it does matter. So for whatever that's worth. In terms of, agriculture and water efficiency, it's actually a really complicated topic in Colorado, because there's this weird thing I'm not going to be able to explain super well in like the next couple of minutes, but because of the way the water rights work. So if you have the right to divert a certain amount of water, because our water rights are in that CFS, so you have a 20 CFS water right or a 5 CFS, that cubic feet per second water right. And if you have flood irrigation, it's pretty inefficient, which means a lot of that water gets back to the river. And if you are drip irrigating it, more of it is actually going to be transpired and used up in consumptive use. So you end up with, the more your efficiency goes up, the more your consumptive use goes up, and the worse it is for your river flows downstream. So I know it takes a while. Like it kind of blows your mind a little bit, but it's like, very different, like we know in Israel, like they've developed a lot of this like precision agriculture, and they put like each drop of water, next to each plant. And if you're using groundwater as a source, you want to be doing that kind of agriculture, although you can end up with salinity issues and some other problems. But actually in our river diversion flood irrigation system, you actually want the system to be leaky. So anyways, I know we can talk about it more. It's like hard to wrap your head around, but the state is really, but the other part of your question is, so Colorado Water Conservation Board, which gives a lot of grants to different entities to kind of improve water use in the state. They've had for the last few years, and Nature Conservancy and other organizations have been a part of this, like a drought resilience program, and farmers can apply for different kinds of grants to improve the drought resilience of their operations. And there's all kinds of creative ideas, coming out of the ag sector, different kinds of grasses, different sorts of crops, different, some different ways to, do the irrigation. So there's a lot of creativity happening in that sector, but certainly more is needed. Okay.
So
Dad.
I think well, I guess we'll take 2 more questions.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the 6 states trying to have this Colorado River, what do you call it, convention or treaty or whatever you want to call it. What I've read is that they basically stopped talking to each other, and the federal government is trying to sort of force a settlement. Is that still accurate, or are they back talking as far as you know?
As far as I know, they have been in negotiations. I don't know if the exact current status of negotiations. But one of the things about the negotiations, so it's the states, but also for the first time, the tribes are really starting to get a seat at the negotiating table. And so the Colorado River Basin tribes have rights to something like more than a quarter of the water in the basin. And, we're really excluded from the whole original development of the Colorado River Compact, and all of those rules. And that is, and something Colorado has really been promoting is, kind of making sure that the tribal voice is at the table. So that's been really important. So my understanding is that the states, want to continue talking, because like no one's preferred option is for the feds to make the decision. But not 100% sure. Merrill will be our last one.
Yeah, just taking off from Moshe's first part of his question, I've always wondered what happens with climate change when the snow melts earlier and you get rain rather than snow. How does that affect the water downstream?
Yeah, so it's a really great question, and in a few different ways. So the snowmelt runoff can be both earlier and faster. So what is happening is that our low flows later in the late summer and fall are more low faster, because we don't have that kind of sustained melt from the snow. So we're having lower low, we're having higher highs and lower lows. Again, it's that sort of speeding up of the cycle versus, mellowing it out. So that's really stressful on fish populations. So, we've seen fish kills in places where the flows get too low. And so then the oxygen, the water temperature gets too high, the oxygen gets too low. And you can have fish kills as a result of that. And the state does have something called an in-stream flow program to, keep some non-consumptive water in the rivers. And that becomes more and more important with, as you said, that earlier snow melt where we get, those lower, the lower lows. And, it also is kind of incentivizing more reservoir construction, because, water is coming off sooner and faster and people want to hold it back. And, that is also a problem in terms of, can be problematic, for some species, because then again, you're chopping off the highs that are also needed. And, to some extent, some of that can be mitigated with, more wetlands, more riparian areas. Yeah. And the one big major water policy thing that I forgot to mention was water quality and the big Supreme Court decision that was called Sackett versus EPA, which, took away federal Clean Water Act protections for wetlands. So there will be legislation at the Colorado state level this year to put protections back on our wetlands and our ephemeral streams in Colorado. And so again, in terms of advocacy, if that's important to you, when that bill is introduced, because, it will be controversial to talk to your state legislators about supporting the wetlands regulation will be important. Okay, and then so turning
that's
it back
something we
to
ought to support, Moshe.
Absolutely. So thank you again. Thank you so much, Diana, for sharing this presentation with us. It's been really. Sorry. Hey, sorry. 1 second. Rachel, I can't. I'm about 5 minutes. So just a few things to conclude. One is just ways to get involved in CJCA in our work. So there is. Sorry, my dog is suddenly barking. And stop share. Okay, so things, and it's not presenting. We have properly. So we have Faith Climate Library Day next Friday. Please join us. It's going to be really an exciting, informative opportunity to talk directly to our elected officials. So again, I'll put that sign-on link in the chat. 1 second here. So that's the other ways to get involved include, continue coming to these programs. We have a few more from now until the end of the year. if you want to switch out your heating system and water heaters with high efficiency electric heat pumps, call Elephant Energy and tell them that we sent you. You can also join one of our committees. We have an education committee, we have a education and youth empowerment committee, a greening Jewish institutions committee, and an advocacy committee. And also, if you are inspired, we do accept donations. If you can go to our website and donate there. And if you want to get in touch, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via, just again through our website. And I will put our website in the chat. And lastly, so that, if you're interested, please don't be shy. I'm happy to set up a meeting to talk to you more about that. So just to conclude, if we have just a few minutes, perhaps a few toasts, right? Water toasts. We, in Judaism, in the Jewish tradition, we say l'chaim, to life. We know that water is life. So if you have something about water that you want to share, something you appreciate about water, some wisdom about water from the Torah or from another wisdom tradition or even a water fact, I'd love to sort of open the floor for just 2 or 3 minutes to hear if anybody has any water toasts to share. L'maim.
L'maim.
All right, a water fact that Diana can tell me if I'm right or wrong about. The water we're drinking today was around when the dinosaurs were around, right? We're drinking dinosaur piss. Is that right?
Pretty much. That's the water cycle. It just keeps going round and round. So yeah, there's no new water under the sun.
L'maim.
L'maim.
And there's some beautiful I think there's some beautiful prayers around like ending drought. I can't think of them right now, but the Torah talks a lot about drought and water, and in the daily prayers is you're praying half the year for rain and half the year for dew, and so water is really central to the whole Jewish prayer cycle.
L'maim.
Also, the second paragraph of the Shema, which I think often talks about the lack of rain being a punishment, and I think for some sort of liberals and progressive and modern Jews, they either wanted to say that quietly or even take it out altogether. And I feel in the context of climate change, it's important to actually put it back and concentrate on those words and sort of think about the natural consequences of our actions, when because of what we do, we're not going to have enough water, right? We're not going to have the rains in the proper times and the flows that we need. So, really sort of thinking about the tradition that, it is the wisdom of that paragraph is sort of renewed in our present moment.
L'maim. We are something like 98% water ourselves, and it's no wonder that we resonate with water and feel more peaceful around a stream. And let us be good to that which is what we're made of.
L'maim.
When we can, adopt that ethic of seeing our rivers and streams as kin. It's not it's not really a faith expression that is so much in Judaism. It's a little more an indigenous culture, but you wouldn't pollute your relative. So if our culture can start to really see our rivers and our waterways as our kin, I think things would change. So
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you to everybody for joining, and have a good night. And
good night.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Moshe, for the invitation. Bye.
So, Aliza, I know we said we were chat for a moment, but mostly, bye, Diana. Thank you. That was wonderful. That was really great.
I was really, I could have done more on like the hopeful, like you know, like talked about some of my projects, but I always feel weird like being a little too self-promoting, you know, of TNC. But it, you know, some of the random water facts are just kind of fun because people just don't know this stuff.
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, I think people don't think about, you know, water, our interconnections, you know, the cyclical sort of properties of water. I think that's really important. And I guess the only there's a little chaos here in the house, so I have to go help. But just if you the two of you could help promote Faith Climate Lobby Day, you know, just even over the weekend, and you know, bring some flyers to Shoal if you're gonna go, that would be really great. You know, we'd just love to get a good crowd. So
Yeah.
Happy to do that. I'm not sure I'll be able to come this time round.
yeah.
Some crises at daycare mean that I'm a full-time grandmother this week.
Oh, no.
So,
I can come, and so I can also carpool with
Yeah,
people.
so
So I will try to do some. I was kind of focused on this, so I didn't respond to an email, and I'm not sure we're going to make it to Shoal with the snow and whatnot. But yes, do some reach out. You know, if anyone reaches out to you and asks about a ride,
what we're gonna do is we're gonna sort of send out some emails to try to coordinate. You know, actually by zip. You know, choosing people. You know, sort of trying to connect people by where they're living, if they're and to create some carpool connections. So be on the lookout for that. I think we'll probably do that early next week.
okay.
Wonderful. Thanks again, and
Thanks.
I look forward to seeing you, Diana, and Aliza. I hope you get through this period of craziness, and we'll talk soon.
All right, Safta to the rescue.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.
bye.